thank you to each of the witnesses for being here today. Thank you for your service, keeping our communities safe. I want to start by focusing on there are some who are advancing as a political agenda what they are calling defunding the police or abolishing the police. And I want to ask each of the witnesses here, do you think that's a good idea, number one? And number two, what would the consequences be for public safety if we did defund the police? And Ms. Cox, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Senator. I have heard those suggestions, and in my experience in my district, I think that would be very dangerous. For example, in Dallas, we're dealing with hundreds fewer patrol officers than we have had in years past for a variety of reasons, somewhat having to do with the pension fund. And what I have heard through my work on the PSN project is that they need more officers, they need more resources. And we, through virtue of our PSN program, have been able to bring that to them. And they have worked with us to great success, I think, in the neighborhood that we've worked with in bringing resources to that neighborhood. I mean, before we heard stories of just being able to having to go from call to call without being able to do any of the proactive work that we're doing in the neighborhood, and certainly without having the time to do the community engagement work that we've been doing in the neighborhood. So my fear is that if you defund police departments, the very work that we think matters most is the work that's not going to get done.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf.
Thank you, Senator. I would just echo the comments of Ms. Neely Cox and say that I think that what I've heard from this panel and that I would agree with and from the first panel is that we should be investing more money into training law enforcement and providing them with the tools and resources that they need. At the Department of Justice, we have several programs, grant programs.
Okay, thank you for that. We have limited time. Captain Yost?
There's no doubt that there are some things that we can do in law enforcement that would be beneficial. I spoke about it earlier, about the social services that could be added with co-responders to incidents. I can tell you from my own experience the frustration of dealing with people who desperately needed services and not being able to provide them. So there's definitely room for growth. But my fear is that I think it's sort of a buzzword, a defund police. It took on a lot of different meanings. But in reality, if we're talking about expanding services, certainly that's something we should look at and talk about. But if the discussion is to diminish the ability for law enforcement to do its job at the sake of adding additional services, I think that defunding is very dangerous, and I think we're going to hurt the very communities we're trying to help the most.
Okay. Captain Davis?
Yes, I think that just the terminology, I think, has just been there are different definitions to the defunding concept, but community engagement is so important to my community. That would be one of the first areas or sections in the department that would go. The very aspect of the department that builds relationships with communities that, you know, my minority communities really want us to have. Unfortunately, that will be one of the first sections to go. So to defund our police department, I can't imagine who the surrogates would be to take over the work that we do every day. And I don't think, you know, this country really realizes how much work police officers do and have taken on, even in the social services realm. Thank you.
Chief Acevedo?
Thanks, Senator. Defunding the police ranges from abolitionists that think we should get rid of policing. That would lead to chaos. To those that think we need to reinvent police, to those that think we need to take our funding and spend it elsewhere. Our community doesn't want less police, they want better policing. And I can tell you that from Houston, which is the most diverse city in the country, the majority of our community wants investments in both good policing and the social services that they richly deserve and desire.
Chief Cass Stevens?
Thank you, sir. I'll try to be quick. But in the 70s and 80s, our country and our government defunded social services. They defunded all the services that help people with mental health, homelessness, drug addiction, and all of those issues were dumped on the doorstep of law enforcement. And we wonder why law enforcement is struggling to deal with these issues. We wonder why the three largest mental health institutions in our country now are Cook County Jail in Chicago, LA County Jail, and Rikers Island Prison. Because we forced law enforcement to criminalize some of these social ills. And so I would say defunding police is dangerous, but I would also say reinvesting in these social services is absolutely mandatory.
Now, I believe defunding the police would result in more crime, more murders, more rapes, more assaults, more burglaries. Very briefly, do each of you agree with that would be the consequence of defunding the police?
Yes.
I do. I believe the crime rate would go up.
Yes, Senator.
Absolutely.
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 Yes.
Okay, final question. Everyone across the country was horrified at what happened to George Floyd. We watched those videos, those 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and we're horrified. There's no legitimate law enforcement purpose for the abusive conduct that cost Mr. Floyd his life. If there was one specific concrete step that Congress could take to prevent what happened to George Floyd from ever happening again, to protect people's civil rights, what would it be? If each of you would very briefly answer that.
I think that, you know, what we're doing with our swift action on that case, I mean, how they're prosecuting it very quickly and civil rights is looking into that. I think what we really need to think about is how we're engaging in our community and forming the relationships with our community through our police departments. So if Congress could give more grant money to work with those police departments to train and to engage in those communities, to form relationships so that they don't have interactions like that, I think that would be very helpful.
I concur with my colleague that investing more in community policing tactics and community engagement for law enforcement.
Captain Yost?
I would agree with that as well. I think that law enforcement has provided the ability to have a great deal of responsibility. That responsibility does not come without trust. And it is very clear, it is obviously clear and painfully clear that we have lost trust. And I think anything we invest back into the community to rebuild that trust is what's going to make a difference at the end of the day. I would also like to add that, you talk about one thing to do. There's no one thing that's going to fix any of this. But I think one thing that was discussed extensively today was a need for some type of standardization on a policy. And I would submit that there is, in fact, a policy that was put together by 11 organizations, collective agreement with the law enforcement organizations for use of power, use of force, and the training that would go with it would go a great way in having some standardization as well.
And with the indulgence of the chairman, I just want to read a line from your written testimony. A chokehold should never, and that's in your written testimony, never be used against a subject who is restrained or in restraints, and should only be used when deadly force is authorized or justified. And
Yes, I agree with that.
thank you. Chief Davis?
Yes, I believe that my colleagues have talked about training. Training is very important for officers, but in the George Floyd case, I think something was very apparent to the world, that there was a disconnect between the human being and the officer and those individuals that wore uniforms. The duty to intervene was a miserable failure. The culture of policing has to change.
Chief Acevedo?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said, Senator, and the most important thing that we can do is actually more robust processes and laws to help us weed out the bad officers amongst us.
Okay. And Chief Cass-Stevens?
Thank you. First of all, only 40% of law enforcement agencies right now contribute use of force reporting to the FBI's use of force database. I think it should be mandatory for every law enforcement agency. But also, I think that every agency should have some type of early warning system. And if there was an early warning system, in this case in Minneapolis, I think that possibly this officer would have been flagged much earlier on prior citizen complaints, that we could have prevented something like this from happening.
Okay. Thank you. That was helpful.